Indian Economy by Ramesh Singh. Chapter 10. Services Sector. India's dynamic services sector has grown rapidly in the last decade, with almost 72.4% of the growth in India's GDP in 2014 to 15 coming from this sector. Unlike other developing economies, the Indian growth story has been led by services sector growth, which is now in double digits. Introduction. India's services sector has not only outperformed other sectors of the Indian economy, but has also played an important role in India's integration with world trade and capital markets. India's liberalization of services has been a challenging process in several subsectors, but clearly those services where integration through trade and FDI has gone further are also the ones that have exhibited more rapid growth along with positive spillovers on the rest of the economy. There is, however, a concern about the sustainability of a services-led growth process which largely stems from exports of skill-based services. The prevailing view is that for services growth to be sustained, the sector cannot remain dependent on external demand. It must also be driven by internal demand. More broad-based growth within the services is also required to ensure balanced, equitable, and employment-oriented growth, with backward and forward linkages to the rest of the economy. In this regard, further infrastructural and regulatory reforms and FDI liberalization in services can help diversify the sources of growth within India's services sector and provide the required momentum. In recent years, there has been a debate in the country regarding the selection of the sector, which can lead the growth process in the country. This debate originated from the fact that the services sector contributed over 62% in the GDP during the decade 2001 to 12. But the debate was somewhat solved by the Economic Survey 2014 to 15 in favor of the manufacturing sector. The survey has gone to quote several empirical studies of recent times linking both services and manufacturing sectors to a great many real issues: potential to create employment, need of skilled and unskilled labor force, formality and informality of the sector, etc. For this, the idea of Make in India has acclaimed timely action from the government. Again, the importance of expanding the railways and enhancing public investment in it have also been pointed out. These findings are also in line with several other studies of the recent times. Overall performance. The performance of the services sector during 2019 to 2020, April to September, has been sluggish in comparison to the corresponding period of the preceding year. A brief idea about its performance, based on the latest government data, is given below. Growth continued to moderate during 2019 to 20, reaching 6.9% from 7.5% in 2018 to 19. The sector continues to outperform agriculture and industry sector growth, contributing around 55% to total GVA as well as to total GVA growth. By subsector, growth in financial services, real estate, and professional services decelerated to 6.4% during 2019 to 20, and that in trade, hotels, transport, communication and broadcasting services remained on a downward trend, reaching 5.9% in 2019 to 20. However, public administration, defense, and other services witnessed an acceleration in activity during 2019 to 20, with a growth of 9.1%. The Services Purchasing Managers Index, PMI, has stabilized in the recent months above the threshold of 50. Above 50 indicates service sector activity is expanding, after having softened during fourth quarter of 2018 to 19 and first quarter of 2019 to 20. Growth in air passenger traffic has begun to show some signs of recovery after having witnessed a slowdown since mid-2018-19. Rail freight, which was contracting in the past few months, started picking up in November 2019. Bank credit to the services sector has continued to decelerate. The growth in bank credit to services sector was 4.8% as on November 2019 as compared to 28.1% a year ago. The sector now accounts for more than 50% of the gross state value added (GSVA) in 15 out of the 33 states and UTs. In 8 states, services sector account for more than 60% of GSVA. Chandigarh and Delhi stand out with a particularly high share of services in GSVA of more than 80%, while Sikkim's share remains the lowest at 26.8%. FDI inflows, as per the latest data, gross FDI equity inflows, excluding reinvested earnings, into the services sector witnessed a strong recovery, April to September 2019, following a decline in 2018 to 19. Gross FDI equity inflows jumped to reach $17.58 billion during the period, 33% over the last year, which is about 2/3 of the total gross FDI equity inflows into the country. The jump in FDI equity inflows was driven by strong inflows into subsectors such as information and broadcasting, air transport, telecommunications, consultancy services, and hotel and tourism. Trade and services. As per the RBI's balance of payments data, April to September 2019 to 20 compared with the same period of the preceding year, the situation of India's trade and services remained as given below. Services exports during 2019 to 20 had an annual growth of 6.4%. The jump in export growth of travel, software, business and financial services offset the contraction in export growth of insurance and other services, including construction, etc. The robust growth in business services exports was driven by higher receipts for R&D services, professional and management consultancy services, and technical and trade-related services. Services import growth was 7.9%. An increase in import growth for transport, software, communication, and business services offset the contraction in imports of financial and insurance services and the slowdown in imports of travel services. Increased business services payments were primarily driven by professional, management, and consultancy services, and technical and trade-related services. Trade balance in services increased to $40.5 billion showing 4.1% growth rate. The surplus, largely driven by the surplus in software services, which financed about 48% of India's merchandise deficit, partially softening the current account deficit. Composition of services exports over the past decade show that the share of traditional services, such as transport, and value-added services, such as software, financial services, and communications, have witnessed a decline. The share of software services has declined by 4 percentage points over the past decade to reach 40% of total services exports in 2018 to 2019. Yet, India's services exports remain concentrated in software services, accounting for twice the share of the second largest component, business services. This has made the software sector, and therefore overall services exports, quite susceptible to changes in exchange rate, global IT spending, stringent USA visa norms, and rising cost pressures due to increased local hiring in export destinations. Even though global IT spending, as projected by Gartner in October 2019, is expected to accelerate in 2020, rising production costs and uncertainty related to Brexit and US's visa norms pose downward risks to India's software exports. The share of travel services has increased over the past decade together with business services. However, India persistently runs a trade deficit in education services, which falls within travel services, with education imports, i.e., expenditure incurred by Indian students traveling abroad for education purposes on tuition, room and boarding, reaching about US $5.0 billion in 2018 to 2019. India should focus boosting its services exports during bilateral trade negotiations for cutting down trade deficits with the trading partners. Looking ahead, world trade volume for goods and services are projected to recover in 2020 following a deceleration in 2019. Global uncertainty, protectionism and stricter migration rules would be key factors in shaping India's services trade ahead. Commercial services exports, the increasing role of services in economic activity, is also reflected in the growing importance of services in global trade and in India's trade. Major features related to India's commercial services are as given below, comparing to time periods 2005 to 11 and 2012 to 2018. It is evident that both commercial services refers to all services exports excluding government services, exports and goods exports have slowed in India and globally in the recent years. However, while merchandise exports were growing faster than commercial services exports during 2005 to 11, commercial services exports have outperformed goods exports during 2012 to 18. This has led to an increase in the share of commercial services exports in overall exports both in India and globally. As per the latest WTO data, India's share in world's commercial services exports has risen steadily over the past decade to reach 3.5% in 2018. USA is ranked first with a share of 14%, UK ranked second with 6.5% share, and Germany at third with a share of 5.6%. India's share in the global merchandise exports is 1.7%, less than half of the services exports. India now ranks 8th among the world's largest commercial services exporters and continues to register strong growth performance, 10.7% in 2018, relative to the other major services exporting countries, 7.7% for USA, 5.6% for UK, and 2.4% for Germany. While export growth rate for the sector in case of India was 5.9%, the global average was 4.4%. Sectoral situation. During 2019 to 20, most of the subsectors of the services sector witnessed a moderation in growth. The growth in tourism sector decelerated with weaker growth in foreign tourist arrivals and consequently in foreign exchange earnings. In the ports sector, growth in port traffic softened from the previous year. However, the number of wireless phone subscriptions and wireless internet subscriptions increased during the year. A brief discussion is given below on some of the key sectors of the services sector. Tourism sector. The tourism sector is a major engine of growth, contributing to GDP, foreign exchange earnings and employment. In India, the tourism sector witnessed a strong performance from 2015 to 2017, with high growth in foreign tourist arrivals. However, a deceleration has been seen since then. A brief survey about the sector is presented below for 2019, January to October. Foreign tourist arrivals growth decelerated to 2.7% in 2019, from 5.2% of 2018. However, this trend was seen across the world as international tourist arrivals globally also slowed from 7.1% in 2017 to 5.4% in 2018. Foreign exchange earnings have slowed in 2018 and 2019 after registering strong growth until 2017, which totaled $24 billion in a 2% growth. Today, 2018, India is ranked 22nd in the world in terms of international tourist arrivals, up from 26th position in 2017. India now accounts for 1.24% of world's international tourist arrivals and 5% of Asia and Pacific's international tourist arrivals. India ranks 13th in the world and 7th in Asia and Pacific in terms of tourism foreign exchange earnings, close to 2% of the global tourism foreign exchange earnings. Foreign tourists from the top 10 countries visiting India are Bangladesh, USA, UK, Sri Lanka, Canada, Australia, Malaysia, China, Germany, and Russia, around 65% of the total in 2018. Among the foreign tourists, 62.4% tourists visited for leisure, holiday, and recreation, 16.3% for business purposes, and 13.5% was Indian diaspora. The top 5 states attracting domestic tourists are Tamil Nadu, Uttar Pradesh, Karnataka, Andhra Pradesh, and Maharashtra, about 65% of the total in 2018. The top 5 states attracting foreign tourists are Tamil Nadu, Maharashtra, Uttar Pradesh, Delhi, and Rajasthan, around 67% of the total in 2018. Aimed at facilitating international tourism, the government has taken several new initiatives in recent years. 1. E-tourist visa regime started for 46 countries in September 2014, which is now available for 169 countries. With this, foreign tourist arrivals to India on e-visas have increased from 4.45 lakh in 2015 to 23.69 lakh in 2018 and stood at 21.75 lakh in 2019, January to October, recording nearly 21% year-on-year growth from the previous year. 2. E-visa scheme has been further liberalized, which has 5 categories now: e-tourist visa, e-business visa, e-medical visa, e-conference visa, and e-medical attendant visa. IT-BPM sector. India's IT-BPM, Information Technology and Business Process Management Services has been the flag-bearer of India's exports for the past 2 decades and contributes significantly to the economy via employment growth and value addition. The latest information about its performance is as given below. By March 2019, the industry size was of about $177 billion in March 2019. IT services constituted 51% of it in 2018 to 19, followed by software and engineering services, 20.6% share, and BPM services, 19.7% share. A significant part, about 83%, of the BPM industry, excluding hardware, continues to be export-driven, with export revenues in excess of US $135.5 billion in exports of the BPM sector in 2018 to 19. IT services accounted for 55%, and BPM and software products and engineering services accounted for the remaining 45%. Export revenue by destination. USA accounts for the bulk of exports, $84 billion, which is 62% of total BPM exports, excluding hardware, in 2018 to 19. This is much larger than the share of exports going to UK, which is the second largest export market for BPM services, with a share of around 17%. Europe, excluding UK, and Asia Pacific account for 11.4% and 7.6% of the export earnings, respectively. In the past 2 to 3 years, the government has taken many new policy initiatives to drive innovation and technology adoption in the BPM sector, including Startup India, National Software Product Policy, and removal of issues related to angel tax. The Indian startup ecosystem has been progressing and is now the third largest in the world with 24 unicorns, though the gap with the largest, China, 206, and second largest, USA, 203, markets remains significant. Cities such as Bangalore, Delhi NCR, and Mumbai account for around 55% of the total startups in India. Source: NASSCOM study. Port and shipping services. As on January 2019, India had a 0.9% share in world fleet. With 13 major ports and about 200 non-major ports, the situation of the sector has been as given below. Total cargo capacity of ports stood at 1,452.64 million tons per annum, MTPA, at the end of March 2019, more than doubling from 628.03 MTPA at the end of March 2010. Ports such as Paradip, Chennai, Visakhapatnam, Deendayal, Kandla, and JNPT had the highest cargo capacities as of March 2019. The total numbers of ships owned by Indian companies stood at 1,414 as of August 2019, up from 1,040 in 2010. Overall port traffic growth witnessed an acceleration between 2013 to 14 and 2016 to 17, but has decelerated since 2017 to 18, with traffic handled at major ports growing at close to 1% in April to December 2019. The turnaround time of ships, which is a key indicator of efficiency of the ports sector, has declined continuously, almost halving in the period 2010 to 19 to 2.48 days. The shipping turnaround time has declined across all major ports and is now the lowest at the Cochin, 1.47 days, New Mangalore, 1.93 days, Vio Chidambaram, 1.96 days, and Chennai, 1.98 days, ports, and the highest at the Kolkata, 3.84 days, port. As per the latest UNCTAD data, the median ship turnaround time globally is 0.97 days, suggesting that India has room to further improve upon the efficiency at ports. Space sector. The space program of India has grown exponentially since its modest beginnings 5 decades ago, moving from providing simple mapping services in the 1960s to many more uses currently. This includes design and development of a series of launch vehicles and related technologies, satellites, and related technologies for Earth observation, telecom and broadband, navigation, meteorology, and space science, R&D in space sciences, and most recently, planetary exploration. The latest position of the country's space sector is as given below. India spent about $1.5 billion on space programs in 2018. However, India's government space expenditure still lags behind that of the major players in the space sector, such as USA, which spent about 13 times more than India in the space sector in 2018. China, which has become a key player in the space sector in the recent years, also spent about 7 times more than India in 2018. India has launched around 5 to 7 satellites per year in the recent years with no failures, barring one in 2017. On the other hand, Russia, USA and China dominate the satellite launching services with 20, 31 and 39 satellites respectively in 2018. There have been 3 key areas of focus for India's space program, namely, 1. Satellite communication, with INSAT or GSAT system as the backbone to address the needs for telecommunication, broadcasting and satellite-based broadband infrastructure in the country. 2. Earth observation and using space-based information for weather forecasting, disaster management, national resource mapping and governance. 3. Satellite-aided navigation including Gagan and Navisi. In terms of player and applications, the space activity in the world is undergoing tremendous changes. This has been marked by a shift in engagement of space activities, from government agencies pursuing national needs and space exploration activities to non-governmental, private sector agencies aggressively pursuing commercial needs. Space systems are also being actively used for national security purposes by most countries. The global space economy for 2018 tallied about $360 billion US. In light of the growing number of satellites, launch vehicle missions, and application programs, the ISRO has been pursuing the policy of engaging Indian industries in the sector. Government has identified the following 5 areas for attracting private investments in the 1. Production of Polar Satellite Launch Vehicle (PSLV). 2. Satellite integration and assembly. 3. Production of composite materials. 4. Production of solid, liquid, cryogenic, and semi-cryogenic propellants. And 5. Production of electronic packages, testing and evaluation for avionics and satellite subsystems. Offshore fund management. The government has identified the financial services sector as one of the champion services sectors to enable onshoring of the India-related financial services, which are currently being rendered from global financial centers. This would provide an impetus to financial services exports and high-skilled employment. Despite India's strong performance in services exports, India's financial services exports have remained stagnant, averaging about $5 billion in the recent years. As a result, the share of financial services exports in overall services exports has almost halved from 4.2% in 2011 to 12 to 2.3% in 2018 to 19. One type of financial services that is currently being rendered from global financial centers and could be potentially brought onshore is the asset management activity of offshore funds. These offshore funds located in tax and regulatory-friendly jurisdictions such as Singapore, Luxembourg, Ireland, Hong Kong, and London pool investments from offshore investors and invest in India via the Foreign Portfolio Investment (FPI), private equity, or foreign venture capital investment (FVCI) route. Such funds include the India-focused offshore funds, which invest only in India, and the regional or global diversified funds with partial investment allocation to India. As foreign investment into India continues to increase in the coming years, onshoring the fund management activity of offshore funds to India would benefit the economy in the following ways. 1. Contributing to the continued expansion of India's asset management industry, which has been witnessing significant growth in the recent years. The Asset Managers Roundtable of India, AMRI, estimates that fund management activity of almost 25% of FPI, PAY and FVCI funds' total assets under management, AUM, could be potentially onshored to India by 2020, and potentially a greater share of AUM in the coming years. Assuming total AUM of FPIs at US misplaced and $326 billion by 2020, this implies that nearly $82 billion of PAY and FVCI funds, i.e., $217 billion in total assets, could be potentially managed onshore in India by 2020, according to AMRI estimates. 2. Generating employment for high-skilled finance professionals. 3. Gain through the management fee received by fund managers for managing the offshore funds would constitute as financial services exports. Based on a conservative assumption of 1% management fee, compared to 2% globally, the AMRI estimates that onshore management of $2.2 billion in fund management fees and therefore financial services exports in 2020. At present, the fund management activity of these offshore funds is being undertaken by fund managers, often of Indian origin, located in offshore jurisdictions, since their presence in India would create tax implications for the offshore funds' profits. The challenges. In April 2016, the government introduced safe harbor provisions as Section 9 Income Tax Act, 1961, under which, on satisfying a set of eligibility conditions, the offshore fund would not be considered a resident for tax purposes solely based on its fund manager being located in India. However, most offshore funds have been unable to utilize the safe harbor provisions since they have to satisfy a total of 17 stringent eligibility conditions related to the fund's structure, investor composition, investment activity, and fund manager's activity and remuneration. Some of these conditions are not in sync with the structure and investment pattern of offshore funds and nature of FPI inflows into India, and lead to dual compliance burden for offshore investors since they are also required to comply with RBI and SEBI regulations related to end investors in FPIs and round-tripping. In comparison, in key fund management jurisdictions such as USA, UK, Singapore, and Hong Kong, the eligibility conditions under safe harbor provisions for offshore funds are fewer and less stringent in many cases, with discretion available to tax authorities to evaluate the offshore fund's structure and investment pattern and allow for exceptions on a case-by-case basis. In view of the above challenges, the Commerce Ministry's High-Level Advisory Group, FLAG, report, September 2019, recommended simplifying the tax framework and removing tax residency risk for offshore funds wanting to onshore their fund management activity given that the offshore fund and fund manager are registered with SEBI and compliant with SEBI regulations. Operationalizing the safe harbor regime of Section 9 Income Tax Act, 1961, would enable onshoring the fund management activity of India-focused offshore funds and potentially regional or global offshore funds with partial allocation to India. Manufacturing versus services. All the focus being on the manufacturing exports in India has distracted attention from what might be a no less noteworthy development. In past few years, it is India's exports of services that has changed in the most significant and perhaps alarming way. One can see the problem looking at market shares. India's share of world exports of services, after surging in the mid-2000s, has flattened out. What makes this development puzzling is that, in recent years, the composition of Indian exports of services is more favorable than that of Indian exports of manufactured goods. More of the former goes to the United States, and more of the latter to Asia. Since Asia has slowed down more rapidly, India's exports of manufactures should have been more affected. Furthermore, in 2015, the rupee has depreciated strongly against the dollar, which should have helped India's exports of services. These developments have longer-term implications. Realizing India's medium-term growth potential of 8 to 10% will require rapid growth of exports. How rapid this should be is suggested by comparing India's export performance in services with China's performance in manufacturing at a comparable stage of the growth surge. China's global market share in manufacturing exports beginning in 1991 and India's global market share beginning in 2003 were roughly similar. The magnitude of the challenge becomes evident when examining China's trajectory over the last 15 years. To achieve a similar trajectory, India's competitiveness will have to improve so that its services exports, currently about 3% of world exports, capture nearly 15% of world market share. That is a sizable challenge, and recent trends suggest that a major effort at improving competitiveness will be necessary to meet it. Global negotiations. India aims to position itself as a key player in world services trade. To promote services exports, the government has taken a number of policy initiatives, says Service Exports from India scheme, for increasing exports of notified services from India, organizing GES, Global Exhibitions on Services, and SCs, Services Conclaves. Besides, Some initiatives in sectors like tourism and shipping have also been taken in this regard. Given the potential of India's services exports, services sector negotiations both at multilateral and bilateral and regional levels are of vital importance to India. Some of the recent negotiations are as given below. WTO negotiations. Though the 11th Ministerial Conference, MC, of the WTO ended without a ministerial declaration or any substantive outcome, India saw certain favorable outcome from the 10th NC of the Multilateral Trade Body, Economic Survey 2017-18, 1. Implementation of preferential treatment in favor of services and service suppliers of least developed countries, LDC, and increasing LDC participation in services trade. 2. To maintain the current practice of not imposing customs duties on electronic transmissions, e-commerce, until the next ministerial conference to be held in 2017. 3. India, together with 20 other members, have notified preferential treatment to LDCs in services trade. India has offered this in respect of A. Market access, B. Technical assistance and capacity building, and C. Waiver of visa fees for LDC applicants for business and employment. Before the 11th MC of the WTO, India made a proposal to the WTO for a global pact to boost services trade. The proposal, Trade Facilitation in Services, TFS, is mainly aimed at ensuring easier norms for movement of foreign skilled workers or professionals across borders for short-term work, portability of social security contributions, reasonable fees for immigration, cross-border insurance coverage, boosting medical tourism, and publication availability of relevant information for cross-border supply of services. World Bank data shows the growing share of services in the world economy, the sources said, adding, however, that global trade flows in services remain subject to numerous border and behind-the-border barriers, Ministry of Commerce and Industry. Bilateral agreements. The bilateral agreements signed by India in recent times are 1. Comprehensive bilateral trade agreements signed, including trade in services, with the governments of Singapore, South Korea, Japan, and Malaysia. An FTA in services and investment was signed with the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, effective since mid-2015. 2. India has joined the RCEP, Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, plurilateral negotiations. The proposed FTA includes the 10 ASEAN countries and its 6 FTA partners, viz. Australia, China, India, Japan, South Korea, and New Zealand. The RCEP is the only mega-regional FTA of which India is a part. 3. India is also engaged in bilateral FTA negotiations including trade and services with Canada, Israel, Thailand, the EU, the EFTA, European Free Trade Association, Australia and New Zealand. Dialogue is underway with the US under the India's Trade Policy Forum, TPF, with Australia under the India-Australia JMC, Joint Ministerial Commission, with China under the India-China Working Group on Services, and with Brazil under the India-Brazil Trade Monitoring Mechanism, TMM. Restrictions and regulations. One major issue in services is the domestic barriers and regulations. Domestic regulations, in strict WTO terms, include licensing requirements, licensing procedures, qualification requirements, qualification procedures, and technical standards, but here other restrictions and barriers are also considered. While there are many domestic regulations in our major markets, which deny market access to us, and therefore need to be negotiated at multilateral and bilateral levels, there are also many domestic regulations in India which hinder the growth of this sector. Since domestic regulations perform the role of tariffs in regulating services, there is need to list the domestic regulations in India which need to be curbed to help growth of the sector and its exports, while retaining those which are necessary for regulating the sector at this stage. An indicative list of some important domestic regulations in India, which need to be examined for suitable policy reforms in the services sector, is as follows. Trade and transport services. Some constraints in these sectors include restrictions on interstate movement of goods, which could ease with the adoption of the Model Agriculture Produce and Marketing Committee (APMC) Act by many states, the Multimodal Transportation of Goods Act 1993, which needs revision to ease the existing restrictions on transportation and documentation through different modes of transport, particularly restrictions in the Customs Act, which do not allow seamless movement of goods, and restrictions on free movement of cargo between inland container depots, ICDs, container freight stations, CFSs, and ports. Construction development. In this sector, bottlenecks result from continuation of restrictions under the Urban Land Ceiling and Regulation Act, ULCRA, in some states, namely Andhra Pradesh, Assam, Bihar, and West Bengal, which have not yet repealed it, and the confusion in the process required for clearance of buildings even after the repeal of ULCRA by passing of the Urban Land Ceiling and Regulations Repeal Act 1999 by the other states. There is also lack of clarity on the role of states as facilitators in the land acquisition policy, resulting in increasing number of court litigations, adding to risk profile of builders or projects, thereby restricting lenders from extending finance to such builders or projects. There are also restrictions on floor area ratio, FAR, in many states, and other restrictions like the application of bylaws or regulations and its exemptions, example, increase in FAR which varies from project to project and is sometimes discriminatory. Obtaining environment clearance is another major hindrance. Accountancy services. While the accountancy professionals were hitherto allowed to operate either as a partnership firm or as a sole proprietorship firm or in their own name, since the Indian regulations do not permit exceeding 20 professionals under one firm, the emergence of limited liability partnership (LLP) structure is likely to address this impediment. However, the number of statutory audits of companies per partner is restricted to 20. FDI is also not allowed in this sector, and foreign service providers are not allowed to undertake statutory audit of companies as per the provisions of the laws in India. There are also domestic regulations like prohibition on the use of individual logos for partnership and single proprietorship accounting firms. These regulations need to be relaxed and streamlined to facilitate tie-ups and penetrate foreign markets, given the potential for exporting these services by the outsourcing mode. Legal services. In this sector, FDI is not permitted and international law firms are not authorized to advertise and open offices in India. Foreign service providers can neither be appointed as partners nor sign legal documents and represent clients. The Bar Council is opposed to entry of foreign lawyers or law firms in any manner. Indian advocates are not permitted to enter into profit-sharing arrangements with persons other than Indian advocates. Education services. These come under the concurrent list with multiple controls and regulations by central and state governments and statutory bodies. Regulations of minimum of 25 acres of land to establish a medical college restricts the setting up of medical colleges in cities like Delhi. Patient load factor regulations related to establishment of new medical colleges also need to be in tune with present-day equipment-intensive patient care and modern practices and procedures of medical education. The need for reforms. Indian services sector have the potential to garner higher economic benefits to the country. But there are many issues, both general and sector-specific, including domestic regulations, hinder the growth prospects of the services sector. If these issues are addressed deftly, the sector could lead to exponential gains for the economy. The need of policy reforms in this regards are outlined in the following way. General issues. There are some general issues related to the policy framework which hamper the healthy growth and expansion of the services sector in the country. They are broadly related to the following areas. Nodal agency and marketing. Despite having strong growth potential in various services subsectors, there is no single nodal department or agency for services. An interministerial committee for services has been set up to look into this. But services activities cover issues beyond trade, and a more proactive approach and proper institutional mechanism is needed to weed out unwanted regulations and tap the opportunities in the services sector in a coordinated way. There is also need for promotional activities for service exports like 1. Setting up a portal for services, 2. Showcasing India's competence also in non-software services in trade exhibitions, 3. Engaging dedicated brand ambassadors and experts. Disinvestment. There is plenty of scope for disinvestment in services PSUs under both central and state governments. Speeding up disinvestment in some services sector PSUs could not only provide revenue for the government, but also speed up the growth of these services. Credit-related, the issues here include collateral-free soft loans to support the sector's cash needs and possibility of considering even export or business orders as collateral for creditworthy service firms. Tax and trade policy-related, these include use of net instead of gross foreign exchange criteria for export benefit schemes, the issue of retrospective amendments of tax laws like 1. Amendment to the definition of royalty to include payment of any rights via any medium for use of computer software, 2. Tax administrative measures to tackle delay in refunds, 3. Introducing VAT, value-added tax, refund for foreign tourists, and 4. Addressing the issue of bank guarantees based on past performance to avail of export promotion benefits in services. Outlining future. With plenty of opportunities, the services sector is like an uncharted sea. As yet, its potential has not been tapped fully by India. A targeted policy of removing bottlenecks in major and potential services can result in large dividends in the form of higher services growth and services exports, which in turn can help in pulling up the economy to higher growth levels. The future actions in the sector can be outlined as given below. 1. India's services sector, which showed resilient growth after the recovery of the global economy following the global financial crisis, has been showing subdued performance in recent times. Despite the slowdown, the prospects continue to be bright for many segments of the sector. 2. In future, government's focus on the following are expected to provide impetus to logistics services. A. Infrastructure development. B. Favorable regulatory policies like liberalization of FDI norms. C. Increasing number of multimodal logistics service providers. D. Growing trend of outsourcing logistics to third-party service providers. And E. Entry of global players. 3. Though shipping services are at a low key at present, with increased imports of petroleum, oil and lubricants, for stocks build up to take advantage of low crude oil prices, containerization of export and import cargo, and modernization of ports with private sector participation, recovery of the shipping and port services sector can be expected. 4. The prospects for Indian aviation services have improved following are the fall in prices of aviation fuel, which accounts for nearly 40% of the operating expenses of airlines in India. B. Liberalization of FDI policies in civil aviation. And C. Strong growth in passenger traffic, expected to continue in the near future. 5. The outlook for the retail industry remains positive, as India continues to remain an attractive long-term retail destination despite the various challenges faced by the sector. Following initiatives are expected to give a fillip to the sector: A. Allocation of 1,000 crore rupees to technology and startup sectors. B. Promotion of cashless transactions via RuPay debit cards. And C. Growth of e-commerce. 6. Government's focus on the tourism sector, including easing visas by ETV and building tourism infrastructure, could help in the recovery of the tourism sector. 7. Despite challenges in the global market, the Indian IT industry is expected to maintain double or near double-digit growth as India offers depth and breadth across different segments of this industry, such as IT services, BPM, ER&D, Internet and mobility, and software products. 8. In the telecom sector, the introduction of 4G, which could be a game changer, and inclusion of fiber optic connectivity, which will tremendously increase the reach and bandwidth, along with greater use of mobiles in government's social sector programs, could give a further boost to this fast-growing sector. The working paper of the Ministry of Finance has outlined a very exhaustive suggestions for boosting the services sector of India, deeper and effective in nature. Taking clues from it, the government has been taking timely policy initiatives since then.